Hello, welcome back to the Research Methodology Group at Kyoto University. I am Jingjing Lin. Again, today I am presenting the third episode of Case Study as a Research Approach. This presentation is based on the content of textbooks written by Robert K. And today we are going to present the fourth chapter of the book, mainly talking about how to collect case study data with 6 sources of evidence. And the major two aspects I'm going to cover from this book's fourth chapter is the four principles of data collection and 6 sources of evidence. If you can relate, I would like to help you to relate better with these 4 principles and 6 sources of evidence by using the phone's dial pad. You can imagine from number 4 to number 6 representing 4 principles, using 4 principles to collect 6 sources of evidence in the field work, as you dial 4 first and 6 as a follow-up. This I consider as a memo graphic for learners to, especially early stage researchers, to remember when they are when they are planning to collect data from case study approach. So what are the 4 principles of data collection? As you can see from the screen, we have first use multiple sources of evidence, which I'm gonna present very soon. And then the second one is creating a case study database. Third is maintaining a chain of evidence. And the fourth is exercising care in using data from electronic sources of evidence, such as social media. Let's move to the first principle. That will lead us to first try to understand what are the 6 sources of evidence that we can actually collect data from. The first one is documentation. Second one is archival records, followed by interviews, direct observations, participant observation, and physical artifacts. Well, the documentation actually can be represented by different forms of documents, such as email, letters, meeting minutes, administrative documents like progress reports, formal studies or evaluation related to the case that you are currently studying, or even news clipping and other articles appearing in the mass media. It can be very diverse as a source of evidence. The second source is archival records. That can include, for instance, statistical data that you download from your government's Census Bureau, Statistics Bureau, or some service records available in the organization to, for instance, record the number of clients they served over a given period of year, and other things such as survey data you are collecting during the process or collected by other researchers in their own research. So all these things can be considered archival records. The third one is interviews as a source of evidence. It can be broken into 3 different types. The first one is prolonged case study interview, which can last for like 2 hours, and not necessarily in one sit of 2 hours. It can be divided into multiple sets of interviews with your participants, but in general, it's quite a long interview trying to provoke a very in-depth conversation with your participants. A second type is a shorter case study interview that is typical, like you sit with a person or a group of persons for like 1 hour or even less than 1 hour, just to understand what you are interested in, what what's their perspective of the reality that you are studying. And the third one is a survey interview using structured questionnaire. And that is quite similar to the survey design of a normal survey research. But still, there's some difference. If you are interested, you can look for it more in these books. In these books for the chapter. And let's go to the fourth step, that is direct observations. It can be observations of meetings, sidewalk activities, factory work, classrooms, direct observations that you see when you're doing the field work, such as you find the office layout of an employer that can represent the hierarchy status of the employer in the organization. That is a direct observation. So when sometimes it's necessary, you can also consider taking photographs, like videotaping the whole fieldworks observation, like movements of the group in certain activity, just for later access to such observation to do further analysis. And the fifth source of evidence is actually a special mode of observation when researchers actually are proactively participating in the fieldwork situation by taking on different kind of roles. So in this kind of mode, researchers are no longer passive researcher, but actually actively participating member of the phenomena or environment they are studying. And it actually poses 3 opportunities and 4 challenges when doing participant observation. So for instance, it can be very time consuming, and it can be costly, and you might not have the view of supporting one organization you are studying before entering this kind of participant observation process, but during the whole process of participation, you actually develop this subjective support of the organization, which you didn't have before. So it kind of produces this kind of bias for proper social science practice. So the final source of evidence is physical or cultural artifacts, such as a piece of technological device, a tool or instrument, or a work of art. It's not necessarily always there as a source of evidence for common case studies, but when it is actually, sometimes it can play a very important role in analyzing the phenomena of interest to the research. So why we actually want to use multiple sources of evidence for a case study? That's because we want to reach this kind of triangulation. Patton in 2015 actually categorized 4 types of triangulation. There are data triangulation, investigator triangulation, theory triangulation, and methodological triangulation. And what we have covered so far is actually data triangulation, mainly dealing with the triangulation of data sources. So by developing convergent evidence, data triangulation can strengthen this construct validity of case study. Like what you can see from this graph, there are 2 types of evidence flow here. So on the upper half of this graph, you see the convergence of evidence in one single study. You have one set of findings in the final report, which are supported by different sources of evidence, such as documents, observations, structured interviews and surveys, focus interviews, and open-ended interviews. They are supporting the same set of findings. in one report, in one single study, for instance. And the results they are actually producing together, supporting the same set of research questions that are being investigated by the researchers. And in the lower half of this graph, you see the non-convergence of evidence, actually still similar set of different sources of evidence, yet they are supporting different kinds of findings and conclusions, not quite reaching the convergent results that we intended to produce with case studies, multiple sources of evidence. So there are challenges for using multiple sources of evidence as well. One typical challenge is it's time consuming, resource consuming. At the same time, it's putting a lot of workload and skill requirement for researchers. So in fact, researchers are required to know how to carry out all this very wide arrays of research techniques at the same time in one research project, which can be very, very challenging for early stage researchers, even for senior researchers. As you can see, the highlighted text I'm going to read out here. Unfortunately, many graduate training programs emphasize one type of data collection activity over all others, and the successful student is not likely to have a chance to master the others. To overcome such conditions, you should seek other ways of obtaining the needed training and practice. One such way is to work with a multidisciplinary research team, not necessarily limited to a single academic department. Another way is to analyze the methodological writings of a variety of social scientists and to learn of the strengths and weakness of different data collection techniques as they have been practiced by experienced scholars. Yet a third way is to design different pilot studies that will provide an opportunity for you to practice the different techniques. So even there's not much opportunity actually to enrich you at campus, you can seek different kind of opportunities, in fact, offered by internet, right? So the point of this long paragraph is that you have different ways to still practice different types of research methods by learning from experienced researchers, by practicing in pilot study that you actually create for yourself to practice all these methods. So we're back to the 4 principles of data collection we have finished. The first principle, which is using multiple sources of evidence to collect data. Okay, so now let's move to the second principle, which is creating a case study database. With case study research, the distinction between a separate database and the case study report itself has only slowly become an everyday but not yet universal practice. So the database should be a separate and orderly compilation of all the data, no matter its narrative or numeric form, from a case study. The creation of case study database markedly increases the reliability of a case study. But unfortunately, the problem of establishing a case study database has not been recognized by most of the books on field methods. So it's a very important practice, yet it's not that well presented or described by researchers who actually take on case studies. But it is very important, and Robert Ng actually introduced the 4 components to develop a case study database, considering notes, documents, tabular materials, and narratives made by researchers. Let's go through them one by one. So notes are probably the most common component of a database you're going to produce for your case study. And they are results of various sources of evidence, like in interviews, surveys, documentation, um, archival records, as we mentioned before. And they can be either handwritten, audio taped, or videotaped, or saved in some electronic files. And the main purpose of saving, organizing, or different kind of research notes you take along the process is to ensure efficient access to them in the future by yourself, by your team members, or other people who are interested in your research. The second component is documents, and here we're talking about all relevant documents that can support your research. And you better use like a bibliography tool to like Zotero, like EndNote, to actually produce an index to store and retrieve all these relevant documents to your case study. The third component is tabular materials. They are either directly extracted from a source of evidence in your research design, your case study, or they were created by research team along the process. Okay, so you can include actual surveys and other quantitative data from the fieldwork, for instance. The fourth component is narratives. Here, the author means you are going to compile your own narrative materials as part of the database, and they can include bibliographies, cross-references, the evidence dealing with particular themes or ideas that you spotted during or after data collection, or your own open-ended answers to the questions in the protocol you have by quoting relevant evidence you actually collected, often by using footnotes and citations in such narratives. So we have finished the second principle of data collection, which is creating a case study database. Now let's move to the third principle, which is maintaining a chain of evidence. So as you can see from here, this graph shows you the chain of evidence we're talking about here is quite mutual, let's say mutual direction, like two directions, either from the beginning of the case study questions to the finishing line of case study reports findings. Okay, or it can be backward from case study findings, along back until reaching the original sets of case study questions. Imagine such a scenario. You're reading a case study report and you find something interesting in the findings, yet you want to see what kind of evidence actually led to these findings. So you actually can trace back to the case study database that was made available by the researchers of that case study, and you will see, okay, they use different sources of evidence too in this database. And by looking at different sources of data, you are able to trace back to the relevant sources of data, such as in an interview that was actually mentioned, the actual fact of which led to such finding. You should be able to find out in the actual interview transcript, for instance. And then you saw, okay, that's very nice. It's so far being very smooth. Now you want to understand how they actually designed that interview questionnaire. Okay, so you can trace back again to case study protocol, which listed out different protocol questions. Okay, and you can actually link in the design of different techniques to collect data, you can find them in the case study protocol. Okay, so you find, okay, there are questions like this in the protocol that make sense, which guided all the research design, and which guided the different techniques to collect data. Now I want to understand actually what was the original question that actually got reflected in all these protocol questions. So you can trace back to the first step, which was the research question posed by this case study. So this is just a short scenario showing you how the chain of evidence should be traceable for the reader to go one step backward continuously to find the all the design elements and the results elements are just smoothly connected together in one chain in a logical way and reliable way, of course. Now let's move to the final principle of data collection, which is to exercise care when you are using data from electronic sources of evidence, such as social media. So most of the 6 sources of evidence we mentioned so far can be actually represented by social media. That means social media can be used as a tool to collect all those 6 sources of evidence. Okay, you can do online chatting with your participants, playing kind of like an interview, right? You can send a survey link to those participants, kind of acting like collecting survey data, right? So you can also, in some cases, find social media source is the actual subject of study, and that is a different topic. In this sense, we are talking about using social media as a tool to collect 6 sources of evidence. But when you're doing so, you have to pay extra cautions to the practice, because information can be very overwhelming to the researchers. So you got to set the limits to say when you are going to stop, what kind of data you are going to include, or else it will be too overwhelmed and jeopardized in the process. The second caution you need to pay attention to, the second caution will be your willingness to cross-check the sources you use and the information you derive from them. For instance, if you are using the Wikipedia as a starting source to understand an unfamiliar topic, you should be taking a very careful attitude towards the content being presented in that kind of source such as Wikipedia, because even though the community try very best to produce a very let's say reliable body of knowledge, there's still some human errors or incompleteness that can take place in the knowledge or information they generate. So you have to cross-check the sources you use. The third caution is when you are using sites such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, individual blogs, you should be also remaining highly skeptical. Let's say if you are interviewing someone through Facebook, are you sure that's a person that you want to reach? It's actually that type of person who are chatting with you. So the authentic chatting is one concern. Another one example would be all those claims made on this kind of sites. Are they accurate, right? And a third concern would be when you are trying to use resources directly quoting them from these sites, you have to make sure you have the permission to use the materials, especially like visuals, such as videos, such as audios, music, even soundtrack, graphics. So make sure you don't break any laws or violate any copyright issue. Avoid that in the research. So we have so far finished what we want to introduce for today's episode. That is to follow 4 strategies to search to collect data using 6 sources of data. And in the next episode, we're going to actually analyze the data. And again, we're going to use the dial pad of the phone to visualize this for you as a metaphor. So you can follow 4 strategies and apply 5 techniques to analyze data when you're using case study. I hope you enjoyed this section, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of introducing case study as a research approach to you. Thank you for watching.